So a few days ago, I released The Blue Ridge, which is my most recent cinematic travel film, but one that I made not by traveling, but by staying nearby here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And you know the drill. Today, I want to break it down for you, go through the edits, and then at the end of this video, I'm going to show you kind of like a before and after split screen breakdown of the entire timeline. And I'm going to put that at the end rather than the beginning this time, just so that you have the context of everything I'm going to talk about in this video when you go into it. Before we jump into this breakdown, I also just wanted to let you know about my channel membership. This is a monthly membership that you can join on my channel to get access to raw footage from my videos, as well as extended tutorials and a private Discord server for members only, where you can ask me questions about filmmaking and photography, show me your work, and I'll give you specific feedback on it. And this month, I released a bunch of raw footage from this short film that you can download and play around with for yourself. And I also released an extended tutorial going over very hands-on a bunch of the stuff that went into this edit. And then I also released the pre-production elements from the short film. So my giant document that I put all my planning and shot lists on, as well as all of my storyboards. If that sounds like something that would be useful for you and would help you learn more about your craft, there will be a link in the description. But that being said, let's go ahead and get into this breakdown. First, you need to understand the overall concept that I had going into making this project. And at its most basic level, there are 3 different sequences in this video, each one showing kind of a different part of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We have the gorge, which is very rocky cliffs, this cool canyon and river. Then we have the Smokies in the Great Smoky Mountains, which is more large mountains and forests with a lot of fog and mist. And then we finally have the Blue Ridge, where you have these larger, very grassy hills and ridge lines where you can see the blue layers surrounding you. So 3 very different looking parts of the same location. It's actually pretty similar to Faces of NYC, which is another travel film I made about a year ago exploring New York City. So you'll see throughout this breakdown that if you've seen that video, it's actually a very similar concept and format. I wanted the first 2 sequences to basically be the most romanticized, glammed up version of this location possible. So there are no people pictured after the voiceover. It's all perfect weather conditions, and it's also black and white, which we'll get a little more into later. I made this sequence of time lapses to show this storm rolling in the gorge to transition us into the Smokies sequence. Once again, something very similar to Faces of NYC, where a weather change signals a transition between 2 major sequences in the video. And then once we get into that Smoky sequence, I wanted to really focus on the fog and crazy cloud conditions that you can get in that area. That's what they're known for. That's why they're called the Smoky Mountains. And I really wanted it to characterize that location as having those weather conditions. The problem is getting footage from the right location and with the right weather conditions takes a lot of time and luck. So the bulk of that sequence does come from 2 shoots in the Smoky Mountains where I got very lucky and had perfect fog and low clouds, but I also filled in a lot of gaps using footage that had those weather conditions but wasn't necessarily from that area. So people who are from this area might be able to recognize that this waterfall, for example, is not in the Smoky Mountains at all, but I chose to prioritize the story and structure of the video over having it technically be correct, I guess. The final 3rd sequence, I wanted to then be more kind of personal and real. So instead of big dynamic camera motion, there's a lot of slower static shots. And instead of focusing entirely on the landscape, you see me in frame in a lot of that footage. And instead of black and white, this sequence is the only one that's in color. This sequence, I also wanted to kind of show the reality that goes into capturing that very romanticized version of the location. So we see me researching a trail, getting up early, filling out a camping permit, hiking a long distance. So you kind of see what goes into capturing the first part of the video. So it's kind of saying, you can capture this amazing footage really close to your home, but it's not as simple as just going out and like seeing a sick view. You might have to work a little more for it, and that's okay. I also made storyboards and a shot list for this entire sequence, so it was very planned out, very intentional, the order of shots and the subject matter of each shot. And planning a travel video like this is something I'm actually going to be talking about in a video later this week, so you can stick around for a lot more detail on that. The voiceover in this end sequence to the video also focuses on the Blue Ridge, kind of making it a symbol of the things that make any destination unique from every other destination. And that idea actually didn't come to me until later in the edit. So after I had already finished like a rough edit for a lot of like the first black and white part of the video, I was kind of just banging my head against my desk, staring at a blank Google Doc, trying to write a good voiceover for the last part to really wrap the video up. And eventually, from long enough of doing that, I had the idea to make the Blue Ridge not only into the title of the video, but into a symbol that could represent something for everyone watching the video. And it's kind of just that aha moment when the entire project comes together and you can finalize that concept and like what the video is actually about. And for this one, it just happened to come 2/3 of the way into the project. And then finally, after that voiceover ends, we have these final 3 longer static shots where we return to each of the locations previously visited in the video. And this time we see them in color. So it's kind of supposed to represent going back and seeing them now with like a fresh perspective. That very final shot is also the thumbnail of the video. So ending there kind of just brings it all the way back and wraps up the project. So after that winded explanation of the concept and idea behind this video, let's talk about how I actually made it into a video that you can watch. Starting out with the first step in that process, which is organization and selects. For this video, I had a lot of footage, about 600 gigabytes of raw footage, and I think about 3 hours of selects on the timeline after I had gone through and trimmed out all the good parts. So the first step was just to go through all of the footage, do selects for absolutely everything, and put all of those selects on a selects timeline. And the selects timeline is something I talked about in another video, which I'll link right up here. A lot of the things I talk about in these breakdowns are things that I've talked about more in depth in other videos. So I'll be linking those videos in the cards right up here in the corner, as well as the description. As with most of my projects, the rough cut was by far the hardest, most time-consuming, and most headache-inducing step in the entire edit. The big challenge here was taking so much footage from so many different locations and weather conditions and making it look like it's 3 cohesive sequences in 3 locations. So there was just a ton of experimentation and fine-tuning, swapping out 2 different clips to see which one works best, moving the cut a frame forward, then 2 frames back to find out what flows best. Once I get to color grading and sound design, I know what to do for the most part. Like I have an approach to get through that efficiently, but for the rough cut, it's really just a headache with a ton of experimentation. There's no right or wrong way to do it. For this project, I chose to use music with very dramatic builds. So we have that track in the background kind of carrying along the pacing of the video and really helping to keep it moving and keep it dynamic. So the video starts out very slow with a lot of like longer, lower energy shots, and then gradually builds up to a much faster, more dynamic sequence towards the middle. To keep a consistent sense of pacing and flow, especially throughout that black and white sequence, I focused a lot on camera motion, having these very dynamic, continuous, large motions throughout the shots, and just making sure that there was a continuous sense of motion throughout the entire sequence. Throughout the video, I'm also using a lot of time lapses in a very transitional way. So we have time lapses of the sun rising to intro the video. Then we have time lapses showing this storm rolling in to transition from one sequence to the next. And eventually we end that sequence by showing the storm clearing, also through time lapses. Pacing and time lapses are 2 other topics that I've made really in-depth videos all about. So I'll link both of those in the cards and the description once again. But that being said, let's get into probably what's going to be the most requested topic for this entire project, which is Aidin, why the hell is it black and white? The reasons for the black and white color grade in this video are mostly stylistic, but also a little practical. Practical because when I started kind of just experimenting and grading a few clips before I edited the video, I just wasn't really digging the colors. It's a lot of green and blue, which are colors that I like to desaturate and have the warm tones pop out throughout the video. But there weren't very many warm tones in this one. There weren't really skin tones or anything like that that could contrast from the desaturated greens and blues. So if I graded the footage in like my style, which is very like moody and desaturated, especially around the greens and blues, it just didn't look good. It just looked dull and muddy. So why not just ditch the color entirely? You know? Black and white was also something that I considered early on in the project because, as I mentioned before, I wanted that sequence to romanticize the location as much as possible. So I ended up using black and white mostly to kind of evoke like this Ansel Adams-y, like untouched wilderness feeling. Like we're going back to like an older time when this stuff isn't developed over. And that kind of complements the decision not to show any people or like human structures in that sequence. And also, you guys know that I like to do weird stuff with these travel films and like try and tackle like a concept or an idea that someone hasn't done with a travel film before. So when I wasn't able to find another black and white travel film, why not jump at the opportunity, you know? Not having to worry about white balance and skin tones was dope, but editing without color also presented a few new challenges for my color grading, like particularly having enough contrast in the shot and adequately drawing the eye to the subject. So with my grading, I like to rely a lot on color contrast. In this shot, for example, I have a lot of cooled off lights in the background so that my skin tone, which is warmer, pops off of that cooler background. And with black and white, I can't do that. So I did a few different things when I was grading, the first of which was to make sure to emphasize the full range of contrast from black to white, making sure that every single clip went all the way from true black to true white and had as much contrast of light as possible. And this is really important that you really bring out that contrast in the light since you don't have any contrast in color. If you look at like Ansel Adams photography or like old black and white films, they're oftentimes relying on that really dramatic lighting and having that full range of contrast because you have to when you don't have color. I also used the hue versus luma slider for the first time to make certain parts of the frame darker or lighter. So I could select the green and brighten it to make the foliage a little lighter, or I could select, say, the blues and darken them to bring out some more contrast in the sky. And this tool was really useful for a few shots, but I didn't use it much because you have to be really careful with it. When you use this tool too much, you can introduce a ton of artifacts into your footage. And finally, I used masks, or if you're using DaVinci to color grade, you could use power windows for this a lot more frequently to isolate certain areas of the frame and darken them or lighten them. So on the vast majority of this footage, I'm masking out little areas around the edge of the frame and darkening them, and then masking out the subject in the middle and lightening it so I can really draw the eye to that subject using the contrast and light. And then the last ending sequence of this video is very punchy and saturated, and this is not my usual style at all, but I decided to go for a much more punchy, vivid, saturated grade for this sequence just to contrast as much as possible with the black and white earlier in the video. And as I mentioned before, since that footage is mostly green and blue, if I desaturate those colors like I normally would, it just doesn't look good at all. Now that we've made it through the rough edit and the color grade, let's talk about some effects that I used throughout this video. Some throughout the entire thing on almost every shot, kind of as some icing on the cake, and a few on very specific shots to add some visual effects for the sake of the story. Throughout this video, I added additional animations to a lot of my footage, particularly animating the position of clips to move up or down under the widescreen bars. This is something that I've talked about in another video that you can watch right up here. I also added a rotation effect onto a lot of the drone shots just to give them a bit more of a dynamic feeling and make them blend better with the more organic motion in my handheld footage. Both of those effects contribute to making the video more dynamic and giving it a consistent flow and motion, and I'll link to a couple tutorials down below that'll show you some more specifics on how to pull these effects off. I also use an effect throughout this video to diffuse the highlights, and I use this particularly on this video to suspend reality a bit, to give it kind of almost like a fantasy vibe, like something you're not used to seeing with your own eyes. And this is one of my favorite effects in the book. I use it all the time, and once again, I made a separate video all about it that'll be linked in the description. Another effect I use a couple times in this video to kind of suspend reality and give it that fantasy vibe is this long exposure water effect, where it makes a video look like a long exposure photo and you get those really nice silky water trails. And this is once again something that I made a separate tutorial about. Description. Next, let's talk about this shot where I'm driving to a trail and the camera is mounted to the outside of my car, because that's not what's happening at all. Basically, I just set up my tripod, rolled my window down, and got this shot of me pretending to drive when in reality, I'm just sitting in my driveway. Then on the way to another trail, when it was kind of blue hour light outside, I basically just took my phone, stuck it up to my car window, and recorded for like 30 seconds and just got basically what the window would see with a bunch of mountains and trees passing by. Then I cracked them both open in After Effects, flipped the iPhone clip so that it would move in the right direction to make it look like the car is moving forwards, and then I set it to a screen blend mode so it would act like a reflection, so the dark parts would disappear and the lighter parts of the effect would be more noticeable, how an actual reflection in a window would look. It's also very important here that the window is rolled down, not only so that you can actually see my face, but so that there aren't any additional reflections in the glass that won't be moving and will completely ruin the effect. Basically, there's no glass and the iPhone clip is acting as though it were the glass. Then I duplicated the clip of me, quote unquote, driving, brought it to the top of the comp and masked out the window. So we would have just the outside of the car as the foreground and the reflection would only appear where it should. Finally, to blend the clips together, I color corrected the iPhone clip to match the shot of me, and then on an adjustment layer over the entire composition, I used a wiggle effect in After Effects to simulate some really fast, subtle camera shake, kind of like the car is moving on this bumpy road and jittering the camera a bit, so we have both layers kind of shaking around. That effect, adding that extra little bit of shake, does a ton to sell this effect. For that clip and most of the other footage that I shot at night or during blue hour, I had to use a plugin called Neat Video to remove some noise from the footage. I also used a plugin called Flicker Free on most of my time lapses because I shoot them on aperture priority. So you end up with a little subtle flicker in the final shot. So I just used this plugin called Flicker Free that removes it. And then finally, I used a plugin called RSMB, which stands for Real Smart Motion Blur. And I use this on a ton of my footage, but especially time lapses and drone shots to give them a realistic amount of motion blur. Neat Video, Flicker Free, and RSMB are all fantastic plugins that I use all the time, and I can't recommend them enough. I'm not affiliated with any of them, but hey, if they want to, I'm in. And finally, sound design for this project was kind of a unique challenge because I had to ask myself what sounds a landscape would make in a video. So a lot of these clips are just shots of like mountains and trees, and I want them to have that extra layer of sound design to characterize them and give them some more life and motion, but like, what sound does a mountain make? You know? The first pillar of this was just really detailed ambient sound design. So instead of just grabbing like a random forest ambient sound, I would add, you know, the sound of kind of bugs and insects, then some birds, then water dripping off the trees, and then wind in the trees, and really just building out a thorough ambient track that covers all those bases and really makes the viewer feel like they're in that location. And then I just had to get more creative than usual with what sounds were kind of implied by the footage. Like a lot of the clips that have foliage in them, I used kind of like a branch rustling sound effect to transition between those clips. And that's a sound that's not actually happening in front of the camera, but since you're seeing a shot of foliage, it makes sense. I also used like this kind of like earthy, rumbly sound on a lot of the mountain and canyon clips. Basically, I just downloaded the sound effect of an avalanche and then put a heavy low pass filter on it. So it filters out all of the higher frequencies and you end up with just like this low, earthy rumble. And I added that to give a little more atmosphere to the mountainy shots. Sound design is a little different for every single project I make, but I do have like 5 or 6 videos all about sound design. So if that's a topic you're more curious about, I know you guys ask me a lot of questions about my sound design, you can check out that playlist right up here. That being said, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I feel like it's been a really long time for this video, but it's now the moment we've all been waiting for. I'm done yapping and I'm going to show you the before and after breakdown of this video. So if you haven't seen one of these before, I put the raw footage over here, no color grading, effects, animations, anything. Final video over here, color graded, animations, everything polished off, and then I put the timeline in Premiere at the bottom of the screen, so you can really just see exactly what went into the edit. Once again, if you want some more insight into how I made this project, there will be a link in the description where you can join my channel membership, where you'll get access to the raw footage from the film, as well as an extended tutorial going over a bunch of other edits that went into the project. You can also follow me on Instagram at Aidin Robbins. I've been sharing a lot of additional like behind the scenes and photos from this short film on there. Stick around for a few more videos diving into how I made this film in the coming weeks. Enjoy the breakdown, and I'll see you in the next one. You know, I've never really appreciated my backyard. The Carolinas have always just been what I'm stuck with. At best, a creative challenge of making something exciting in a not so exciting location. But spending most of this year stuck in place changed the way I see these mountains. So this time, it's different. I want to show you a few places where I feel small, where I feel the ground under my feet and the air around me, places where I feel inspired, right here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I don't think it's a secret that I love mountains. I visited Washington's Cascades and Iceland's cliffs, not to mention the many more I hope to see in the future. As tall and dramatic as those peaks may be compared to the ones here, there's one thing that I just haven't found anywhere else. Something that simplifies miles of terrain and makes me feel like I'm walking through a watercolor painting every time. And that's the blue layers. They're a detail you might not even notice until you zoom in or closely examine the horizon. But to me, they represent the unique qualities that every location has, even my own home. So while we're still stuck here, get up a little earlier, hike a little longer, look a little further into the distance, and find that one thing that makes your home special. Find your Blue Ridge. And I think you'll start to see home a little differently.